A racist cop bullies and tries to intimidate a black woman in court, without knowing she's an undercover FBI agent, and within seconds, she does something that leaves the entire room speechless. It started like a lot of stories do, with silence being mistaken for submission, with brown skin being equated to guilt. One wrong step into the wrong courtroom, just a minute early for a different hearing, and she found herself standing near the front row, holding her documents, scanning the room to make sure she was in the right place. But she wouldn't get the chance to confirm. The moment the officer at the door spotted her, he walked up with the kind of authority that doesn't ask, doesn't wait, doesn't listen. He didn't approach with protocol or decency, he approached like she didn't belong there. Not in that building, not in that room, not in that world. "Excuse me, miss. This courtroom isn't open to just anyone," he said loud enough for heads to turn. "You need to go wait outside where you belong." She blinked, unsure if she'd heard correctly. "I said out. Now." She tried to speak, tried to explain she had a legal reason for being there, that she was simply early, that she hadn't broken any rule. But her voice barely made it out before he raised his hand and cut her off. "I don't need an explanation. This area's for legal representatives and family of the accused. Unless you're about to scrub the floor, I suggest you get moving." That was it. That was the moment. The sound of muffled laughter from the back. The uncomfortable shuffle of someone pretending not to have heard it. The judge hadn't even arrived yet. But the damage had been done. The look in her eyes wasn't anger. Not yet. It was restraint. It was centuries of inherited survival wrapped into one woman standing in heels, wearing confidence like armor. But even armor cracks. Even steel remembers every dent. He didn't see her credentials. He didn't ask her name. He didn't care. He just saw black skin, straight posture, and assumed arrogance. And in his world, people like her weren't supposed to be standing there, unless they were wearing handcuffs or holding mops. And what he didn't know, is that she was holding something far more dangerous than either. In his eyes, he had done nothing wrong. A minor correction. A little pushback to keep the wrong kind of people in line. But this wasn't just a man abusing his badge. This was a decorated officer with a deep history of unchecked power, a man with more than one complaint swept under the rug, more than one teenager left afraid to speak up, more than one career threatened for challenging his authority. And most importantly, a man who'd been under investigation for months by a federal task force quietly collecting evidence, connecting him to something far darker than just casual racism. Something coordinated. Something violent. And the woman he tried to humiliate? She wasn't just there for a case. She was the lead. He had no idea that she had walked into that courtroom not by mistake, but as part of the final phase of a months-long investigation. And that she wasn't alone. The very system he thought he was manipulating was already watching him from every corner. And her presence in that room wasn't accidental, it was strategic. But in that moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was the humiliation. The sheer, raw disrespect. The burn of injustice. The weight of being judged in public, again, just for existing. Because this wasn't the first time someone like him tried to shrink someone like her in front of a crowd. It wasn't the first time she'd been made to feel like she had to prove herself 10 times over just to be treated as equal. But what made this moment different, was that she wasn't going to walk away quietly this time. This time, there were consequences. This time, there were cameras. There were sealed warrants. There were federal agents posing as court staff. There were secrets ready to be exposed. And when the moment came, when the silence of the room settled into stillness and all eyes turned to her again, not as a target, but as the center, she reached into her bag, stood tall, and did something no one was prepared for. What happens when the person you thought you could humiliate without consequence, turns out to be the one holding your fate in their hands? And more importantly, how far will justice go when it finally speaks out loud? Stick around. Because the look on his face when he hears those 10 words. That's where everything changes. Before the story begins, to every black viewer watching this video, you matter. Your voice matters. Your presence matters. At Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism. This channel is a space of respect, justice, and powerful storytelling that reflects real struggles and unforgettable victories. If you've ever felt silenced, overlooked, or disrespected because of the color of your skin, this story is for you. Now sit back, enjoy the ride, and get ready for a twist you won't forget. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join our community. We're just getting started. She was the kind of woman who could walk into a room and shift the atmosphere without saying a word. There was something in the way she held herself, shoulders squared, spine straight, eyes sharp, that told you she wasn't someone to underestimate. Not because she was loud. Not because she demanded attention. But because she had mastered the art of silence. Of watching. Of calculating. Her name was Amara Johnson, and she had spent her entire life being told she didn't belong, in classrooms, in boardrooms, in uniforms, in high-clearance offices, and every time, she found a way to not only belong, but lead. Amara had grown up in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, raised by her grandmother, a retired teacher who believed in books like other people believed in prayer. Her childhood wasn't easy. It was a mix of scraped knees, second-hand clothes, and lessons about survival. But it was also filled with wisdom, discipline, and a deep, unwavering sense of purpose. Her grandmother used to say, "They'll see the skin first, baby. But you make sure they remember the mind." And she did. Amara didn't just study, she devoured knowledge. Law. Psychology. Criminology. She wasn't just smart. She was strategic. By her 20s, she was already making waves, first as a federal analyst, then as a field agent, eventually joining the FBI's Civil Rights Unit. Her mission was clear: expose and dismantle institutional corruption. Not with guns blazing or courtroom theatrics, but with precision, with paperwork, with truth. She wasn't interested in fame. She was interested in change. And she knew, painfully, that real change didn't come fast. It came with patience. With persistence. With sacrifice. By the time Amara relocated to Charlotte, North Carolina, she was no stranger to discomfort. The city was growing, diverse on the surface but fractured beneath it. Tensions between the police and black communities were rising. Cases of brutality and bias were becoming harder to ignore. The public was demanding answers, but the system kept closing its doors. That's when the Bureau sent her in, quiet, embedded, unofficial. She wasn't there to make noise. She was there to listen. To gather. To connect dots no one else could see. And over time, those dots started to form a name. Officer Mark Benson. Mark wasn't just a cop. He was a career officer with over 15 years in the Charlotte Police Department. Decorated. Respected. Untouchable. On the surface, he was everything the department praised: firm, assertive, a man who knew how to handle the streets. But behind closed doors, his record was murky. Excessive force complaints, suspicious traffic stops, disproportionate arrests of young black men, a reputation for being strict with the wrong kind. Nothing ever stuck. Every complaint was dismissed. Every internal review came back clean. He was protected. And that made him dangerous. What Amara discovered in her early weeks shocked even her: whispers of coordinated cover-ups, missing body cam footage, private texts among officers mocking victims, connections to a militia-style group operating just outside city limits. It wasn't just bad policing. It was deliberate. It was systemic. And at the center of it all was Benson. She knew she couldn't go after him directly, not without evidence. Not without leverage. So she waited. She followed. She built the case, brick by brick, until it was nearly ready to fall. But what Amara didn't anticipate was how personal it would become. It started with her nephew, Jalen, a straight-A high school senior, track star, college-bound. One night, on his way back from a friend's house, he was pulled over for a broken taillight. Within minutes, it turned into an arrest. Suspicious behavior. Resisting instructions. No camera footage. No clear explanation. Jalen was taken in, booked, and charged with intent to distribute. Marijuana was found in the car. No fingerprints. No witnesses. Just a convenient discovery, by none other than Officer Benson. Amara was furious. She knew her nephew. He wasn't perfect, no teenager was, but he wasn't a criminal. He wasn't even close. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, to pull rank. But she couldn't. Not yet. If she exposed herself, the entire case would collapse. The investigation would be compromised. So she kept quiet, publicly. But privately, she prepared. When the court date arrived, Amara didn't come in blazing. She dressed simply, carried only the essentials. She had no intention of making a scene. She just wanted to observe. To watch Benson in action. To feel the temperature of the courtroom. But fate, or perhaps design, had other plans. The moment she stepped into the room, 5 minutes early, documents in hand, walking calmly toward the second bench, she felt it. The shift. The gaze. The heat. And then, the voice. "Excuse me, miss. This courtroom isn't open to just anyone." She turned slowly, unsure if he was speaking to her. "You need to go wait outside where you belong." There it was. The condescension. The tone. The humiliation, delivered like a verdict before she'd even said a word. And when she tried to explain, when she gently lifted her papers as proof of her presence, he dismissed her like a child interrupting grown folks' business. "I don't need an explanation. This area's for legal representatives and family of the accused. Unless you're about to scrub the floor, I suggest you get moving." Heads turned. Some smiled nervously. Others looked away. A few whispered. But no one spoke up. No one challenged him. Because in their eyes, he was in charge. And she? She was just another black woman taking up space where she shouldn't. Amara didn't move. Not right away. Her hands trembled slightly. Not with fear, but with fury she had to bury. This wasn't the plan. She hadn't wanted to confront him yet. She hadn't wanted to show her face. But now, the decision was being made for her. Her cover, her silence, her patience, all being chipped away by the very arrogance that had brought her there in the first place. Benson didn't see her as a threat. He saw her as a mistake. And that was his biggest mistake of all. Because the moment he opened his mouth, he set off a chain of events that couldn't be stopped. The courtroom, the investigation, the silence, everything was about to shift. And none of them were ready for what was coming. Not the judge, who thought it was just another minor case on a quiet afternoon. Not the prosecutor, who had unknowingly been handed false evidence. Not the courtroom staff, who had grown used to looking the other way. And especially not Benson, who had spent years thinking there would never be a reckoning. But reckoning had arrived. And it wore heels, carried a briefcase, and had federal clearance to bring down an empire from within. Still, Amara remained still. Not out of submission, but out of strategy. There was one last move to make. One last card to play. And when the time came, it wouldn't be loud. It wouldn't be dramatic. It would be undeniable. What happens when the predator finally meets the trap? And more importantly, what did she have in that briefcase that would change everything? The hallway outside the courtroom buzzed with quiet tension, the kind that clings to the air like static before a thunderstorm. Amara stood near the water fountain, her back straight, her fingers lightly gripping her briefcase, eyes fixed on the double doors that led back to the space where everything had begun. Jalen's trial wasn't set to begin for another 15 minutes, but she'd arrived early again, deliberately this time. This wasn't just strategy, it was positioning. She wanted to observe every face, every step, every whisper. Nothing would be left to chance. Not today. Inside, the courtroom hummed with the low murmur of lawyers preparing their cases, the clacking of keyboards, and the rustle of suits and papers. The prosecution looked confident, armed with evidence that Amara knew was planted. A file filled with fabricated reports, cherry-picked footage, and testimonies from officers whose loyalty was to the badge, not the truth. On the other side, Jalen sat quietly beside his court-appointed attorney, a young man who looked fresh out of law school and too nervous to challenge anything. Jalen's shoulders were hunched, eyes down, trying to shrink himself out of existence. Amara's heart twisted. This wasn't just a case. This was a message. A message to anyone who dared to stand tall. A message she intended to rewrite. She entered the courtroom with slow, deliberate steps. She could feel Officer Benson's eyes track her the moment she crossed the threshold. He was standing near the witness stand, arms folded, radiating smugness. The kind of man who walked through life without fear of consequences. She didn't acknowledge him. She didn't need to. Her presence was enough. "Miss Johnson," the judge called out, glancing down at a paper on his desk, "you're here on behalf of the defendant?" "No, Your Honor," she replied, her voice steady. "I'm here as a federal observer." Benson smirked. "Since when do observers dress like they're about to interview for a receptionist job?" A few people chuckled under their breath. The judge tapped his gavel once, barely making a sound. Amara didn't flinch. She turned toward Benson and spoke evenly. "Funny how you always seem to know what someone's job should be just by looking at them." He leaned closer. "I'm just saying, you carry yourself more like a secretary than a Fed. Maybe you should stay in your lane." The silence that followed wasn't loud, but it was deafening. The room felt suddenly too small, too tight. Amara's stare didn't waver. Her voice, when she spoke again, was calm enough to cut glass. "Keep talking. Please." Benson blinked. "Excuse me." Amara said nothing else. She returned to her seat, placing her briefcase gently on her lap. Her fingers tapped once on the latch, then stilled. Inside that case wasn't just paper, it was power. But not yet. Timing was everything. As the trial began, Amara watched carefully. She studied every word spoken, every motion made. The prosecution painted Jalen as a troubled teen, implying gang affiliations and hinting at past school suspensions that were irrelevant but meant to color the jury's perception. They spoke with calculated confidence, and their case relied heavily on Officer Benson's testimony. He took the stand with a rehearsed ease, describing the night of the arrest in detail, emphasizing how Jalen had been evasive, how the vehicle smelled strongly of marijuana, how he'd felt threatened. "Did the defendant ever verbally threaten you?" the defense asked during cross-examination. Benson shrugged. "Not in words, no. But you get a feel for when someone's about to snap. It's a cop's instinct." Amara clenched her jaw. That line, that vague, intangible instinct, was the same one used to justify so many wrongful stops, so many violent outcomes. She glanced at Jalen, who stared at the table in front of him, eyes empty. After court recessed for lunch, Amara found herself in the hallway again, this time face to face with Benson near the vending machines. He leaned casually against the wall, sipping his coffee like they were co-workers on a break. "You know," he began, voice low, "I could have had you removed this morning. But I figured I'd let you play dress-up a little longer." She raised an eyebrow. "You're surprisingly comfortable for someone who's about to be very uncomfortable." He chuckled. "You don't scare me, sweetheart. You think I haven't dealt with angry women in suits before? The system doesn't work for people like you. You know that. Hell, you've probably experienced it firsthand." Amara stepped forward, voice barely above a whisper. You keep thinking this is about you versus me. It's not. It's about truth. And unfortunately for you, the truth doesn't care how long you've worn a badge. He snorted. You think the truth matters in court? I've got a badge, a record, and a courtroom full of people who trust me. You're just another angry black woman with something to prove. She smiled faintly. And you're just another man with something to hide. Benson's face twitched, just for a second. But it was enough. When court resumed, the tension was thicker. The defense attorney, seemingly more confident now, began to press harder, questioning the timeline, the inconsistencies in Benson's report, the lack of body cam footage. Every answer Benson gave seemed just a little too practiced. Amara could sense the discomfort growing in the room. Jurors shifted in their seats. The judge leaned forward more often. Even the prosecutor began to glance at his papers with growing uncertainty. Then came the break. A sudden recess, called without explanation. Benson left the room first, pacing in the hall, muttering into his phone. Amara stayed seated, calm, still. She could feel the storm building, not just in the courtroom, but inside her. She thought of her grandmother. Of the words that raised her. Of the faces of the boys who never got to grow up because no one had protected them. Of the weight she carried, not just as a black woman, not just as an agent, but as a protector of those who never got their justice. And she knew, it was time. But not yet. One more breath. One more moment. Because when the truth came out, it had to come like thunder. Loud. Unmistakable. Irreversible. She glanced at her watch. 20 minutes. 20 minutes until Benson took the stand again. 20 minutes until the next document inside her briefcase would see daylight. 20 minutes until the courtroom would hear something they could never unhear. She leaned back in her chair, eyes locked on the door. Let him walk in smug one last time. Let him smile, thinking he's already won. Because what was coming would turn everything upside down. The courtroom was unusually quiet for a space that had seen dozens of cases pass through that week. But this wasn't just any case. There was a stillness in the air, not peace, but pressure. The kind of pressure that builds in the chest before it becomes a scream. Jurors sat up straighter. The judge flipped through his pages slower than usual. Even the prosecution, who had been confident in their presentation all morning, now looked like they were rehearsing doubts behind tight eyes. Amara didn't speak. She didn't blink. Her fingers rested calmly on the edge of her briefcase, but inside her chest, the storm had already arrived. She didn't need to prepare herself, she had done that her entire life. Now it was time to let it unfold. Benson re-entered with the same cocky posture he always carried, the slight smirk tucked into the corner of his mouth like a signature. He adjusted his tie, glanced toward the jury box, and gave a nod, as if this was all part of a routine, another day, another kid going away, another notch in his win column. But there was something off in the way he held himself now. His steps had an edge. His eyes scanned the room too quickly. He was watching Amara. Carefully. He didn't smirk at her this time. He didn't say a word. But the tension between them had changed. She could feel it. The defense called him back to the stand. He took his seat and looked directly at the attorney, not at Amara, not at Jalen, as if the very existence of their eyes on him was beneath his attention. The questioning resumed. At first, it was standard, routine clarifications about the events of the night of the arrest. But the tone began to shift. The defense attorney pulled out a new sheet of paper, adjusted his mic, and asked, without ceremony, if Benson had submitted any additional documentation after the arrest, specifically, regarding the chain of custody for the evidence. Benson hesitated. A flicker. Just a breath. Then he nodded. Yes. I completed an addendum the next morning. Standard procedure. The attorney lifted a second document and held it up. This one? Benson leaned forward. Yeah. That's it. The attorney glanced at the judge, then at the gallery. And you're aware that this document has two different timestamps? One on the physical printout and another embedded in the digital metadata. There was a pause. A long one. Benson's smile thinned. I'm not an IT guy, he replied, voice low. I file reports. I don't track metadata. Right, the attorney nodded, stepping back slightly. Well, just to clarify, this document was edited 8 hours after it was submitted. At 2 in the morning. From a personal device, not a precinct terminal. Can you explain that? Benson's jaw tensed. I already said, I added a note the next day. Forgot to mention something. Amara opened her briefcase. She didn't rush. She didn't flinch. She simply reached in and pulled out a thick file, closed with a red string, then rose to her feet. The judge looked up. Excuse me, she said calmly, walking toward the bench. With the court's permission, I have documents that materially impact this case and this officer's credibility. I'd like them entered into the record immediately. The prosecutor stood instantly. Your Honor, this is highly irregular, the judge raised a hand. Sit down. Let's hear it. Amara handed the file to the clerk, who quickly delivered it to the bench. The judge opened it, his eyes scanning page after page. Internal memos. Surveillance logs. Email transcripts. Photographs. Names. Evidence trails. Amara turned to face the room. For the past 6 months, I have been leading an ongoing federal investigation into corruption within this city's police department. Officer Benson has been one of the central subjects of that investigation. This file contains evidence that he falsified reports, planted evidence, used racial profiling in his patrols, and maintained active contact with known members of a white supremacist militia group operating under the radar outside of Mecklenburg County. Gasps broke through the silence. The prosecutor's mouth fell open. Benson's face went pale, the color draining so fast it looked like someone pulled a plug from inside him. He opened his mouth, but no words came. Amara didn't stop. The evidence used against Jalen Johnson was fabricated. The drugs were never in the car. The footage was deleted, then partially reconstructed by our digital forensics team. Benson's body cam didn't malfunction, it was manually disabled. And the witness he listed on the arrest form? Doesn't exist. The judge looked from the file to Benson, then to Amara. Agent Johnson, are you submitting this as official federal evidence? Yes, Your Honor. It's been signed off by the Bureau and the Department of Justice as of this morning. A warrant for Officer Benson's arrest has also been issued and will be executed today. Benson finally stood, fists clenched, voice low and furious. This is a setup. You're just trying to ruin me. You planted this whole thing, didn't you? Amara turned to him with a calmness that cut deeper than rage. You planted your own downfall the moment you believed your badge gave you the right to play God with people's lives. You've been doing this for years. You thought no one would hold you accountable. You were wrong. He pointed at her, voice cracking now. You don't get it. You think you're some kind of hero? This system's always worked like this. I didn't invent it. No, Amara said, eyes locked on his, you didn't. But you chose to feed it. And now you'll answer for every name you tried to erase. The bailiffs moved quickly. Benson didn't resist. There was nowhere to run. The moment his hands were cuffed behind his back, the courtroom erupted, not in applause, but in stunned disbelief. Whispers. Phones buzzing. Eyes darting. Jalen stared, mouth slightly open, his attorney frozen beside him. Amara walked over and sat beside her nephew. She leaned in. You okay? He nodded, slowly. You knew all this? I had to be sure, she whispered. And now I am. The judge banged the gavel. All charges against Jalen Johnson are dropped, effective immediately. This court is adjourned. As the room began to clear, Amara stood still, her body calm but her heart pounding. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The world had shifted, not all at once, but enough. Enough for one truth to rise above the noise. Enough for one boy to breathe freely again. But even as the doors opened and sunlight spilled into the hallway, she knew this wasn't the end. Because justice wasn't a moment. It was a mission. The hallway outside the courtroom was a blur of noise and confusion, reporters scrambling for statements, clerks whispering urgently into their phones, and officers moving with a sudden awareness that one of their own had just fallen from grace in front of an entire room. Amara moved through the chaos without a word, her step steady, her face unreadable. Jalen followed just behind her, still stunned, his movement stiff like he didn't know whether to cry, collapse, or run. The weight of what had just happened hadn't fully settled on him yet. It hovered, like a shadow just out of reach, waiting for quiet to take its final shape. In a side room down the corridor, Amara gently nudged the door open and motioned for him to sit. He didn't speak right away. Neither did she. They sat in silence for nearly a minute, the distant echo of courthouse noise muffled by the walls. Jalen looked at her finally, his face a mixture of confusion, betrayal, and awe. When he spoke, his voice was low, almost a whisper. You knew all along. Amara didn't answer right away. She folded her hands together, letting the silence stretch just a bit more before responding. I knew something was wrong from the moment they pulled you in. I didn't know how far it went until I started digging. And I had to dig carefully. His eyes narrowed. But you didn't tell me. I thought you gave up on me. I thought I was alone. Her face softened, but her voice remained firm. I never gave up on you, Jalen. Not for a second. But if I had told you what I was doing, even accidentally, it could have ruined everything. I needed Benson to think he was untouchable. I needed him to stay comfortable. Because that's when people make mistakes. He stared at the floor, his jaw clenched. You don't know what it felt like. Sitting in that cell. Knowing I didn't do anything. Watching them look at me like I was trash. Like I was already guilty. Amara's voice dropped, thick with emotion. I do know what that feels like. More than you think. And that's why I did what I did. That's why I had to let you sit through it, even when it broke me. He looked at her then, really looked, and saw the exhaustion under her strength. The quiet rage. The weight of decisions no one should have to make. His lips parted, but no words came. She reached across the table and took his hand, her grip firm. This isn't just about you, she said. It's about every kid they've done this to. Every file they've buried. Every life they've tried to erase. Today wasn't just a trial. It was a spotlight. Jalen shook his head slowly, voice shaking. I'm not some symbol. I'm just a kid who wanted to go home. I know, she replied, her voice cracking for the first time, and I'm sorry it had to be you. But because it was you, they couldn't ignore it this time. A knock at the door interrupted them. It opened slightly, and a young black female officer stepped in, her eyes flicking to Amara with a deep, respectful nod. Agent Johnson, they've cleared the lobby. You're good to leave now. Press is waiting outside. Amara stood, smoothing her jacket, her body moving on autopilot even as her mind swirled. She turned to Jalen. You ready? He hesitated. Do I have to talk to them? She shook her head. You don't owe them anything. But they're going to talk. They're going to write their stories. You have a chance to make sure the truth gets heard. Jalen exhaled, wiped his face with the back of his hand, and nodded. Together, They stepped out into the hallway again, only to be met with a wave of flashing cameras and shouting voices the moment they hit the lobby. Amara raised one hand, signaling calm. The reporters pressed forward, yelling questions. Agent Johnson, was this a planned operation from the beginning? Can you confirm that Officer Benson will face federal charges? Was the department aware of the investigation? Amara waited for the noise to settle, then spoke clearly, her voice carrying over the crowd. Today was about accountability. For too long, this system has protected people who abuse power. That ends now. What happened to Jalen Johnson isn't just his story, it's the story of many others. And I promise you, this investigation is far from over. Jalen didn't say a word, but he stood taller beside her. The cameras caught it, the shift in posture, the quiet dignity, the power of a young man who had been reduced, then rebuilt. He didn't need to speak. The world could see the truth on his face. After the press cleared, they stepped into the afternoon sun, blinking against the light. A car waited at the curb, dark windows, federal plates. Amara opened the door for Jalen first, then slid in beside him. As the car pulled away, the courthouse shrinking behind them, she finally let herself breathe. A deep, long breath that felt like it had been waiting years to escape. Jalen leaned his head back against the seat, watching the city pass by. So, what happens now? Amara looked out the window for a moment before answering. Now we take this case to the next level. Benson was just the beginning. There are more names. More lies. More files to unseal. And with what happened today, they won't be able to hide anymore. He turned toward her. And what about me? She looked at him with a small, tired smile. You go live your life. Graduate. Go to college. Be who you were always meant to be. Let me handle the rest. Jalen nodded, but something in his eyes had changed. There was strength there now. A sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. I want to help. Amara studied him. You already have. The rest of the ride was quiet. But it wasn't silence filled with fear or uncertainty, it was a silence heavy with meaning. A silence earned. When the car pulled up to his house, Jalen paused before getting out. Thank you, he said softly. Amara reached out, squeezing his shoulder once. Go inside. Hug your mom. Eat something that didn't come from a vending machine. You're free now. Don't waste that. As he walked to the door, Amara watched him go, the weight of everything still pressing on her chest, but for the first time in a long time, it was mixed with something lighter. Something close to relief. Her phone buzzed. A message from her supervisor. Press conference tomorrow. DOJ wants you front and center. She locked the screen and leaned back in her seat. Tomorrow. Tomorrow would be another fight. Another spotlight. Another wave of resistance. But tonight? Tonight was victory. Quiet, hard-won, and deserved. And as the car pulled away from the curb, she closed her eyes and let it wash over her. The noise, the tension, the fear, all melting into the knowledge that justice had finally spoken back. Loud enough for the whole world to hear. The days that followed moved fast, but for Amara, every second felt heavier than the last. The truth had cracked open the surface of the courtroom like an earthquake, but what no one on the outside could fully grasp yet was just how deep the fault lines really went. Mark Benson's arrest wasn't just a headline, it was the first domino in a chain reaction that had the potential to shake the entire local justice system. Within 48 hours, 4 other officers were quietly placed on administrative leave. 3 more were named in sealed documents handed off to federal prosecutors. Internal Affairs, once seen as a hollow department stuffed with red tape, was now scrambling to cooperate. And behind closed doors, conversations turned panicked. Every file that Benson had touched was now under scrutiny. Every case, every conviction, every forgotten complaint. Judges were privately asking for briefings. Reporters were digging deeper. People were waking up to the reality that what they thought was a system of order was, in parts, a web of silence and control. Amara spent long nights at her desk, reviewing statements, overseeing the rapid escalation of a case that was no longer hers alone. She had led the opening charge, but now the Bureau was assigning a full task force. Agents were flying in from out of state. Digital analysts were combing through years of encrypted group messages. It was bigger than Charlotte. Bigger than Benson. The scope was becoming national. But for Amara, it was still personal. Every night, her thoughts drifted back to Jalen, to the look on his face when he realized someone believed him, to the trembling in his voice as he asked why he'd been chosen. She knew that trauma like a scar that never fully fades. And while his name had been cleared in court, the world outside didn't reset so easily. People still stared. Classmates still whispered. Not everyone celebrated the truth. Some resented it. Meanwhile, the media pressure swelled. News outlets ran endless segments. Talk shows debated her tactics. Some praised her courage, hailing her as a hero for exposing systemic rot. Others questioned her judgment, accusing her of ambushing the justice system and compromising due process. Comment sections became battlegrounds. Think pieces flowed like wildfire. One national news anchor called her a necessary disruption. Another labeled her a rogue agent playing judge and jury. She didn't respond to any of it. Public opinion wasn't her mission. But the noise was impossible to ignore. What hit her harder, though, came from within. Agents she'd once worked with now kept their distance. Colleagues she'd mentored suddenly became polite, careful, detached. Whispers followed her through the corridors of the Bureau. She was respected, but now feared. Admired, but inconvenient. Then came the meeting. A conference room on the 6th floor, closed doors, cold coffee, and senior agents in suits who didn't smile. Her supervisor, Agent Caldwell, spoke in his usual controlled tone, reading from a prepared statement about procedural reviews and media containment. He thanked her for her service. He acknowledged the success of the operation. Then he slid a document across the table, a reassignment order. Temporary leave. Mandatory debrief. Possibly relocation. All couched in bureaucratic language about protocol, but the message underneath was clear: she had shaken the table too hard. They were giving her space, not as a reward, but as a warning. She stared at the paper in silence, then finally asked what none of them dared to say out loud. Am I being punished for doing my job? Caldwell didn't flinch. You're not being punished, Agent Johnson. You're being preserved. For whose benefit? He leaned forward, lowering his voice. You drew blood in a house full of people pretending to be clean. That comes with consequences. You know that. She signed the form. Not because she agreed, but because she understood the rules of the game. You could burn the mask off the system, but that didn't mean the system stopped breathing. It just watched more carefully. That night, as she packed her office into 2 boxes, Amara sat on the edge of her chair and let herself feel it all: the victory, the bitterness, the exhaustion, the flicker of something like regret. Not for what she'd done, but for the cost of doing it. Justice had a price. And sometimes, the people fighting hardest for it paid it alone. At home, the silence felt different now. Not peaceful, but earned. Her phone buzzed with dozens of missed calls, interview requests, and messages of gratitude from strangers she would never meet. But the one message that stopped her cold was from Jalen. It was just one sentence. Do you think I'll ever feel normal again? She stared at the screen for a long time before replying. No. But you'll feel stronger. In the following weeks, the DOJ expanded the investigation. Benson's arrest opened up records that had been sealed for years. Cases were overturned. A defense attorney filed a motion to reopen 23 trials. Mothers who had buried sons wrote letters to Amara, thanking her with trembling hands. But with each new truth came another layer of complexity. One of the suspended officers filed a countersuit, claiming he was being targeted for political reasons. Community leaders clashed, some wanted more transparency, others warned against demonizing all law enforcement. A protest erupted outside the police precinct. Signs filled the air. Voices rose. And beneath the noise, the real question pulsed like a wound: could justice ever truly fix what had already been broken? Amara found herself asking the same thing late at night, sitting alone in her apartment, files open in front of her, a glass of untouched water sweating on the table. She thought about how much she believed in the system when she joined. How she thought integrity could be enough. But now she knew better. The system didn't bend for truth. It bent when someone forced it to. And even then, it snapped back quickly. She hadn't changed the whole machine. She'd just broken one of its gears. But maybe, just maybe, that was enough to slow it down. Her reassignment came through officially 2 weeks later. Not to another city, but to Washington. A new unit, focused on civil accountability. It was a promotion on paper, but she saw the strings behind it. A way to elevate her while moving her out of the blast radius. Keep her visible, but controlled. And yet, something inside her welcomed the change. Because maybe the next fight wasn't in courtrooms or dark offices. Maybe it was at the top, where policy was born and rewritten. Before she left, she asked to meet with Jalen one last time. They met at a small diner, tucked in the corner booth where no one would bother them. He looked different now, more settled in his skin, but still processing. The kind of healing that takes years. "You doing okay?" she asked, sipping her coffee. He shrugged. "I have good days. Some not so good. I get stares at school. Teachers talk to me different now, like I'm made of glass or something." Amara nodded slowly. "That won't last forever. People forget headlines. But what you do next, that's what they'll remember." He hesitated. "I think I want to go into law. Maybe help people like me. Like what you did." A quiet smile touched her lips. "You'd be good at it. Better than me, probably." He laughed for the first time in weeks. "I doubt that." She leaned in, her voice softer. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone. You survived something most people couldn't imagine. That strength, no one can take that from you." He looked at her then, eyes clear. "But I want to use it. I don't want what happened to be the end of the story." And with that, she knew the baton had passed. The world might still be broken. The system might still fight change with everything it had. But as long as people like Jalen stood up, not just angry, but purposeful, then the fight wasn't in vain. As she left the diner and walked into the cool evening air, her phone buzzed again, a new alert, another article, another name exposed. She didn't open it. Not yet. She looked up at the sky instead, exhaled, and whispered something only the wind could carry. "We're not done." The flight to DC was quiet, smooth, but Amara barely noticed the clouds below or the polished silence of the cabin around her. Her mind was still anchored to the street corners of Charlotte, to the faces she'd seen outside that courthouse, to the weight of every unspoken story that had come rushing to the surface in the aftermath of Benson's fall. The reassignment felt less like a promotion and more like an exile dressed up in a new title, and she couldn't help but wonder if it was the Bureau's way of keeping her in the game without letting her play the same way again. But she wasn't naive. She understood the cost of disrupting a system that fed off silence. She had made a choice the day she opened that briefcase, and now, every room she walked into would be filled with both respect and discomfort. People would clap in public and whisper in private. She wasn't the agent who played by the book anymore. She was the one who rewrote it mid-chapter. Arriving at the new office came with formal smiles and stiff introductions. The building was modern, glass walls and neutral colors, but Amara felt the same old tension under the surface. Politeness wrapped in caution. Her new supervisor, Director Lisa Maynard, greeted her in a meeting room surrounded by sleek panels and LED lighting. Lisa was sharp, a seasoned strategist who had spent more time in DC politics than field work, and she wasted no time in getting to the point. She praised Amara's work in Charlotte, highlighted the national impact it had already begun to generate, and then gently outlined the scope of her new role, Special Advisor on Federal Civil Rights Enforcement. A desk job, mostly. Review protocols. Draft oversight recommendations. Serve as a face when the cameras roll. It was important, yes, but it wasn't the field. It wasn't the fight. It was the follow-up. Amara nodded through it all, taking notes, asking questions, but her thoughts wandered. She wasn't looking for status. She was looking for purpose. She didn't want to be the face of justice. She wanted to be its hands. After the meeting, she stepped outside for a moment, needing air. The street buzzed with the rhythm of DC life, polished suits, echoing heels, horns and sirens and the chatter of movement. She leaned against the railing near the steps and pulled out her phone. No new messages. Just a missed call from a number in Charlotte and a voicemail she hadn't listened to yet. She hit play. It was Jalen. His voice was uncertain at first, but then steadier, like he was pushing through the weight of what he needed to say. He talked about starting an internship at a local law office. Said he'd been invited to speak at his school about his experience and was thinking about saying yes. Then, near the end, his tone shifted. You ever feel like, people want to hear your story, but not really your voice? Like, they're proud of what you survived, but not ready to face what that survival means? I feel like they want me to smile and say it's all better now. But it's not. Not really. I don't know, just wanted to talk. You always seem to know what to say. Amara sat with that for a long time. She knew exactly what he meant. The world loved survivors who knew how to make their pain palatable. Who didn't make people uncomfortable. Who didn't challenge the narrative of redemption without reckoning. She had felt that same pressure since stepping off the plane, to be graceful, composed, digestible. But she wasn't here to comfort anyone. She was here to keep digging. That night, she called him back. He answered on the first ring, his voice warm and surprised. You weren't sleeping, were you? She asked. He laughed. Nah, not really. Couldn't. I keep thinking about everything. About what's next. About how to use this without it using me. Amara leaned back on her couch, staring out the window. You don't owe anyone a version of yourself that makes them comfortable. Tell your story how it is, not how they want it. There was a pause on his end. What if I tell it wrong? You won't, she said. Because the truth doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to be yours. They talked for another hour, about school, about the law office, about the people who still avoided him in the hallway and the ones who now clung to him like he was a symbol. He was navigating something bigger than most people his age could handle, but he was doing it with a quiet resilience that reminded Amara of her younger self. Before the titles. Before the politics. Before the layers of armor that had built up around her heart. In the days that followed, she threw herself into the work. Her name now carried weight in policy rooms. She was invited to speak on panels, consulted on task force revisions, asked to weigh in on legislative proposals. She gave interviews, carefully worded, and attended meetings with agency heads who used phrases like systemic realignment and rebuilding trust. But late at night, she still read through case files. Names of people who hadn't gotten their moment in court. She marked them, one by one. Not for publicity. For justice. Then came the email. A whistleblower inside the Charlotte Police Department had reached out. A low-ranking clerk, young, scared, but furious. He had seen the file purges after Benson's arrest. Documents deleted, names erased, records tampered with. Amara set up a secure line, arranged a private meeting. When the clerk showed up, shaking and pale, he handed over a flash drive and a printed list of altered files. At least 30 cases had been scrubbed. Victims, most of them black and brown, had their complaints rewritten or buried. Internal reviews were doctored. Names had been swapped out. Evidence had been reassigned to different officers to protect the ones under scrutiny. Amara's hands shook as she read. This wasn't negligence. This was organized erasure. She forwarded the evidence to DOJ leadership immediately. But the response came back cautious. They needed to verify. They didn't want to risk another media explosion. Internal politics. Reputation management. She stared at the screen, fury bubbling under her ribs. She had watched the system pretend to shift. But here it was again, folding in on itself, trying to survive. The next day, she walked into Director Maynard's office, laid the documents on her desk, and said one sentence that changed the course of everything. If we don't act now, then we're just as guilty as they are. Lisa looked at her, long and hard. You're forcing my hand. Amara didn't blink. Good. Within 48 hours, the DOJ launched a secondary investigation. Quietly. Carefully. But this time, Amara wasn't just an advisor. She was appointed lead. The night before the announcement went public, she called Jalen again. You were right, she said. They're proud of what we survive, but they don't always want to face the cost. He sighed. So what do we do? We keep telling the truth, she said. And we don't stop until they have to listen. He didn't say anything right away, then finally spoke, his voice calm, steady, resolute. Then let's make sure they never forget. As she hung up, Amara stood by her window, looking out at the lights of DC blinking like stars caught in glass. She knew the road ahead would be hard. The system didn't break cleanly. It shattered in fragments that cut the ones trying to fix it. But she wasn't here to be safe. She was here to make sure the next truth couldn't be buried. And this time, she wouldn't be the only one digging. The room was dimly lit, the only illumination coming from the muted glow of Amara's laptop as she sat at the long, wooden table in the Bureau's secure archive division. It was well past midnight, but sleep felt irrelevant now. Files were spread in front of her like a battlefield, each one holding fragments of lives interrupted, truth contorted, stories manipulated beyond recognition. These weren't just numbers or evidence tags, these were real people, real wounds, and every line she read carried the weight of decisions that had been made in silence, with the confidence that no one would ever look close enough to see what was buried beneath. And now, here she was, digging through it all, page by page, case by case, feeling the full gravity of a legacy that didn't belong to her but had somehow become hers to confront. The whistleblower, whose name she still kept confidential even among her closest staff, had sent another batch of documents, this time detailing a timeline of when and how the erasures were ordered. Some had been deleted minutes after internal meetings. Others coincided with promotions being handed out. There were signatures that didn't match, timestamps that contradicted officer statements, logs that led to computers under locked clearance. It was no longer a matter of suspicion. This was orchestration. Amara knew this would reach further than anyone had prepared for, possibly judges, maybe city officials, maybe even people she had once worked beside and trusted. But stopping now meant becoming part of the problem, and that was never an option. Later that day, she found herself standing in front of a task force assembled under her new directive. A mix of agents, some seasoned, some just starting out, all watching her with a mix of curiosity, respect, and guarded uncertainty. She cleared her throat, not needing to raise her voice to command attention. She didn't give them a speech about ideals. She gave them facts. The cases that were altered. The evidence that disappeared. The people who were silenced. She spoke their names. She didn't sanitize the pain. She didn't offer comfort. She offered mission. When she finished, there was no applause. Just silence, the kind that comes when people are handed something too heavy to hold, but know they have to carry anyway. After the meeting, she stepped outside for air, and Lisa Maynard joined her on the bench just outside the building's east exit. Lisa lit a cigarette, despite the signs on the wall, and stared out at the traffic. "You're pulling threads that haven't been touched in decades," she said without looking at Amara. "You know that, right?" Amara folded her arms. "They shouldn't have been left untouched." Lisa exhaled slowly, the smoke curling around her words. "What you're doing, it's going to make enemies. Some in uniform. Some behind desks. Some wearing suits with government IDs." Amara turned toward her, expression unwavering. "Good. If they're part of this rot, they should be afraid." Lisa flicked ash onto the concrete, then finally met Amara's gaze. "I'm backing you. But if this gets political, and it will, I can't guarantee the DOJ won't try to cut the wire." "Then I'll take the explosion," Amara said, voice quiet but firm. "As long as the truth gets out." That night, her apartment felt emptier than usual. The city lights cast long shadows across the hardwood floors, and Amara sat by the window, knees drawn up, the silence settling around her like a second skin. She called Jalen, not because she had news, but because her spirit needed grounding. He picked up quickly, the sound of wind rustling through his phone. He was walking, probably through his neighborhood. His voice was softer than usual, but there was warmth in it. "I heard about the task force," he said. "People at school are talking. They say it's going to open everything up." Amara let out a tired breath. "I hope so. We're finding things that, it's worse than I thought." Jalen was quiet a moment. "You ever get scared?" "Every day," she answered without hesitation. "But fear's just part of it. It doesn't stop me anymore." He stopped walking. "How do you know it's worth it?" She closed her eyes. "Because every time I read a case file and see someone who never got their chance to speak, I realize I'm their voice now. And as long as I have it, I have to use it." He paused again, then whispered, "You're not alone in this, you know." Amara felt a sharp tug in her chest. "I know. But sometimes, it still feels like I am." "Then let me remind you," Jalen said, his voice stronger now. "You're not." They spoke for a while longer, about nothing urgent, nothing big, just small things that felt like anchors. When they hung up, Amara stared at the ceiling, heart a little fuller, and knew that the path she was on wasn't just about justice. It was about connection. About making sure the next generation didn't have to walk through the same fire without someone clearing the way. The next morning, the press broke a leaked segment of the investigation. Names were named. A judge who'd ignored internal misconduct reports. A prosecutor who'd relied heavily on Benson's cases despite known irregularities. It spread like wildfire. News vans lined the DOJ building by noon. Requests for statements flooded Amara's inbox. She declined them all. She let the files speak instead. One after another, they were uploaded to the DOJ's transparency database, with full supporting documentation. Unfiltered. Undeniable. Protests began that evening. Not in anger, but in resolve. People held up signs with the names of those whose cases had been ignored or dismissed. Photos of Amara were everywhere, some calling her a hero, others branding her a threat. But the image that struck her most was a small placard held by an elderly woman on the front line of the crowd. It read, "My son didn't survive, but his story did." Inside the building, Amara met with the lead DOJ attorneys for strategy updates. Tension was high. Political pressure was mounting. Several senators had issued public statements. Some praised the transparency, others questioned the legality of the data release. One even accused Amara of using her position for personal revenge. She didn't flinch. She knew what this was, the final thrash of a system trying to protect itself. Later that week, as the hearings began in Charlotte for the reopened cases, Amara returned to the city. She walked through the courthouse not as a shadow, but as a force. Eyes followed her, some with fear, some with awe, many with gratitude. She didn't stop for cameras. She didn't need to speak to make a statement. Her presence was the answer to every lie that had once lived in that building. As she sat through the testimonies, watched families step forward for the first time with their truths, something in her heart cracked open. Not in pain, but in purpose. Because this wasn't just about fixing something broken. It was about showing that it could be done. That the cycle could be interrupted. That silence could be replaced with reckoning. And when Jalen showed up at the final hearing, wearing a suit slightly too big and holding a folder filled with notes he'd written himself, a statement he wanted to give publicly, Amara knew the baton had passed again. And this time, it wasn't being taken. It was being carried, willingly, bravely, and with clarity. Because justice, real justice, wasn't a single act or a single voice. It was a wave. And the wave had only just begun. In the final hearing that closed the wave of reopened cases, Amara stood at the back of the courtroom. Not at the podium, not on the stand, not in the headlines. Just quietly present, arms crossed, watching a system finally forced to look at itself in the mirror. The courtroom wasn't the same anymore. The silence it once carried was gone. In its place was a kind of steady defiance, a collective breath held for too long now being exhaled. And when the last wrongfully convicted man was officially exonerated, when his mother wept into his chest and the gallery erupted into applause, Amara didn't move. She just closed her eyes for a moment, letting the gravity of the moment settle inside her. Not as a victory. Not as an ending. But as confirmation that the storm she had caused was worth every gust. Mark Benson, the man who once wore his badge like armor and weapon, was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Not just for falsifying evidence, but for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and multiple civil rights violations. The trial had been swift. The evidence was undeniable. And what broke him wasn't the cell. It was the silence. The silence of a system that no longer protected him. The same system he had used like a shield now treated him like a virus that had to be removed. In his last statement before sentencing, he spoke with bitterness, trying to paint himself as a man betrayed by the very structure he thought he served. But no one bought it. Not the judge. Not the media. Not even the people who had once called him brother in blue. In prison, he would become just another file. Just another name behind bars. Justice had finally spoken, not with vengeance, but with clarity. Jalen, meanwhile, began to find his footing again, not as a victim, not as a symbol, but as a young man forging his future with intention. His speech at the final hearing had gone viral, not because it was loud, but because it was honest. He didn't sugarcoat his trauma. He didn't pretend to have all the answers. But he spoke with the kind of authenticity that couldn't be taught, and people listened. Offers came in, scholarships, internships, mentoring programs. He chose carefully, turning down the ones that wanted to use him as a brand, and choosing those that allowed him to build something real. He started a podcast with 2 classmates called Beyond the Record, giving space for stories like his to be told by those who lived them. His voice, once silenced by a courtroom, now reached thousands. As for Amara, her work didn't slow. After the hearings, she returned to D.C. with a different energy. She no longer had to prove anything. Her position was solidified, not just by title but by action. She was offered a permanent leadership role within a newly formed Civil Rights Enforcement Division, not a token appointment, but one built from the ground up by the very work she had led. She accepted, on one condition: her team would have full autonomy. She wouldn't be the face of reform. She would be the hands that kept it moving. Her office became a hub for change, policy reviews, national audits, internal restructuring of high-risk departments. And she built it her way, with young, diverse voices, with survivors in leadership, with transparency as a standard and not a luxury. One morning, months after the final case had closed, Amara received a small envelope with no return address. Inside was a folded note and a photograph. The note read only, "He didn't make it, but you gave him peace." The photo was of a boy, maybe 13, smiling wide, holding a football. She didn't know his name. She didn't know his story. But someone, somewhere, had seen what she did and felt seen in return. It broke something in her that needed breaking. She sat for a long time with the photo in her hand, letting herself cry, not from sadness, but from release. Because sometimes justice isn't loud. Sometimes it's a quiet thank you that no one else hears. In the following year, changes began to take root across the country. Departments that once rejected oversight now requested reviews. Grants were tied to accountability. Training shifted from tactics to truth. It wasn't perfect. Resistance still came. But the cracks had been made, and through them, light was starting to pour in. Amara continued her work, but she no longer felt like she was alone in the fight. She had allies. She had witnesses. She had impact. And when people asked her how she managed to do what she did, she always answered the same way. I didn't do it alone. I just stopped waiting for permission. And now, to you, the one who listened, who stayed until the very end, let me ask you something deeper than a reaction. Have you ever seen something wrong and convinced yourself it wasn't your place to speak? Have you ever swallowed the truth because the silence felt safer? Because the real power in this story isn't just what Amara did. It's what she chose not to let slide. It's that moment when injustice looked her in the eye and expected her to walk away, and she didn't. She stood. She spoke. She exposed. Not because she was unafraid, but because she refused to be silent. This story is about justice, yes. But more than that, it's about responsibility. It's about what happens when one person chooses to carry the weight of truth even when it shakes the very ground they stand on. And maybe, just maybe, it's a reminder that we all carry that potential. So now I ask you, what would you have done in Amara's place? Would you have stepped forward? Would you have risked everything? Let us know in the comments below. Tell us how this story hit you. Tell us what part made you think twice. And if this moved you, if it lit something inside you. Subscribe to Tales of Twist, because around here, we don't just tell stories. We tell truths. And we promise, the next twist will be just as unforgettable.